Welcome to the Money Love Podcast. I'm your host and money coach, Paige Pritchard. If you're ready to uplevel your results in relationship with money, you're in the right place. Each week, I give you the tools to transform your mindset, manage your emotions, and achieve results with your money you never dreamed were possible. Hello, welcome to episode 16 of the Money Love Podcast. Another bonus episode for you. So you guys have just gotten 2 weeks straight of 2 episodes each week. I hope you guys are enjoying just these extra bonus episodes. I've really loved doing them. And like I said, when it comes to relationships, there's just so many different facets and things that there are to talk about. And I just want to make sure that we're covering all of it. And so in the past couple weeks, if you've been tuning in, what we've been talking a lot about is things in relation to your relationship. So we've been talking a lot about your relationship in terms of money, but then also just your relationship in general. And what I'm actually going to encourage you to do is, if you have not yet listened to episodes 13, 14, and 15, go listen to those first before you listen to this boundaries episode, because having that background about having unconditional love for your partner, about being an emotional adult and what that means and what that looks like, and also having a manual and then being able to drop it is going to give a lot more context to what we're going to be talking about right here in this episode. And it's so important to know that when you're able to do all of those things, and when you do allow the people in your life just to be the most authentic versions of themselves, that allows us to then create the most authentic versions of our relationships. And that's ultimately what we want for ourselves and for others. But the next question that I always get in response to these relationship issues is, okay, so understand emotional adulthood, understand having and dropping my manual, but what about people, or what about certain actions that they take that are just flat out unhealthy, they're destructive, they're rude, or they're harmful to my physical or to my emotional well-being? And people often ask me, like, okay, are you just saying that we're just supposed to just let the people in our lives do whatever they want, even if it's at our expense? And I touched on this on episode 13 when we were talking about financial intimacy. But the answer to that question is no, you're not. Of course not. And that is where the skill of boundaries come in. And that is what we're going to talk about today in this episode. Now, I truly believe that setting clear and respectful boundaries is part of being an emotional adult, because as an emotional adult, you are responsible for your emotional well-being. You take ownership over it. And that means that you also put measures in place to protect it. And that is what boundaries do. It's kind of a combination of everything that we've been talking about, okay? It's knowing that, yes, all adults have free will, and accepting that all adults can do whatever they want, but then you being very clear about the activities and the behaviors that you're going to tolerate and entertain from all the adults that have free will and are out in the world doing whatever they want. So here's a really good example. Adults can smoke cigarettes, right? Any adult has the choice to do that. It's an option for anyone. And people can choose to do that, right? I mean, most of us don't just like walk around all day, every day, like trying to get people to stop smoking cigarettes, because we understand that as an adult, we all have the choice to either smoke or not smoke cigarettes. However, if someone came into your house and started smoking cigarettes in your home, then that would suddenly become a boundary violation. It doesn't really matter if somebody makes the personal choice to smoke a cigarette. But when those actions of another person now start to have a negative impact on your environment, that is when we have a boundary violation and when we need to start setting clear boundaries. Now, that's not likely to happen, okay? Obviously, we know that. Most people aren't just going to stroll into your house and start smoking a cigarette. But it is a good analogy to kind of think of between knowing that adults have free will, they can do what they want, and it's not until the choices that they make start to have a negative impact over our physical or emotional environments that it then becomes our responsibility as emotional adults to put boundaries in place to protect our emotional health. Now, setting and enforcing boundaries is such a powerful tool that you're going to have in your tool belt to make sure that you are protecting yourself emotionally and ultimately creating the most authentic version of the life that you want to live. And most people, when they think about boundaries, they have it all wrong. When most people think of boundaries, they are focused on the other person that they are setting the boundary with. And this makes us think that boundaries are something that we create for other people and something that we put in place to control other people. But the reality is that the opposite is true. The truth is we create boundaries for ourselves. Because when you set a boundary, you are being very clear as to what you will stand for in your life and what you are willing to expose yourself to. And that's why it's important that we all have clear boundaries. Because if you don't have clean boundaries, then people won't know if they're violating them or not. Now, let's define what a boundary is. A boundary is a request that you make of someone to change a certain behavior and a consequence of what you will do to self-protect if they violate that boundary again. So to state it very simply, it's saying, if you do X, I will do Y in response to X. So here's a couple examples. It's saying, if you pop over to my house unannounced, I'm not going to let you inside the house. It's saying, if you're unfaithful in our marriage, I'm going to leave the relationship. It's saying, if you ask me to borrow money, I'm going to tell you no. It's saying, if you start yelling at me, I'm going to ask you to leave or I'm going to get up and leave. Now, I'll say this. Some boundaries are very universal and they're held by a lot of people. Okay, so a lot of us have a boundary over physical assault, right? So we all kind of have this boundary that really doesn't even need to be spoken. That's like, hey, if you physically assault me, I'm going to call the police. But a lot of boundaries that we have are very unique to each of us because all of our emotions are very unique. So I can give you a very clear example of this, right? In that list that I just gave you, like the first one I said was, if you pop over unannounced, I'm not going to let you inside. So for me, I don't feel like I'm emotionally bothered if people just like hop over to my house unannounced. Like it's not a big deal for me. But my husband, Ryan, doesn't like it so much, right? Like he wants everything to be planned. He wants to know if you're coming over so that he can prepare. He just doesn't like the surprise visits. And so because of that, we have put boundaries in place with our family and with our friends that, hey, you need to let us know if you want to come over. If you just pop over to our house unannounced, we're probably not going to let you inside. So that's a boundary that's really important to him. Now, to me, one that I'm pretty sensitive of is yelling. And I remember when we first started dating, Ryan grew up in a family where they're very animated. And not that they would yell and scream at each other, but my family was just more kind of just like subdued, calm, laid back. Ryan's family was a lot more animated. And so that was something that we kind of had to work through because in the beginning, the yelling and the more animated conversation really used to bother me emotionally. And so that was a boundary that I had to put in place that didn't really bother Ryan so much. So again, this is just to tell you that a lot of our boundaries are very unique to each of us, and that's totally fine. Something that is very emotionally taxing to you might not be very emotionally taxing to the next person and vice versa. But the important thing is to identify what your boundaries need to be based on your own unique personality and emotions. Because again, as an emotional adult, you are the one that is responsible for setting those boundaries and protecting your unique emotional well-being. Now, let's talk about when we should communicate a boundary to someone to let them know that a boundary is in place. So like I said, some boundaries are really obvious. Like we don't need to be walking around communicating our boundary about people physically assaulting us. Like we don't need to go to every person and just be like, hey, I just need to let you know that I have this boundary that if you punch me in the face, I'm going to call the police. People are going to be like, well, yeah, obviously. So the more obvious boundaries don't really need to be communicated. But for the ones that are more specific to you, the answer of when it needs to be communicated is when it has been violated by someone. When you have a boundary that has been violated, then at that point, it's time to communicate to the person that violated the boundary that they have violated your boundary and that there's going to be a consequence next time if it continues. Now, this is really important, okay? Listen up. Once a boundary is communicated, the person that you are making the request to can still continue to do whatever they would like to do. Just because you have communicated a boundary does not mean that the behavior of the other person is going to change or it's going to stop right away. And a lot of people get really frustrated and confused with this because they think like, well, I communicated my boundary. Why is this person still doing the thing that I asked them not to do? Like they're still popping over unannounced. They're still asking me for money. And the truth is that even if you have a boundary in place, that does not guarantee that the other person is going to stop doing what you've asked them to stop doing. That doesn't guarantee that the action on the other person's part is going to change. It doesn't change the fact that you are dealing with another adult who has free will to do what they want to do. And many times, the action from the other person is still going to persist even after you have clearly communicated your boundary. And this is the important thing. A boundary is not an ultimatum. A boundary is not, you need to stop doing this or else. A boundary is, you can continue doing what you're doing, but if you continue doing it, then this is going to be my response. Like I've told you over and over, we cannot control the humans. We have no control over what the other person is going to do, but we do have control over our response. And that is the boundary. You make the request, you give them the option to do whatever they would like to do, and then you follow through on the consequence, should there be a boundary violation. Now, this is the most challenging part, okay? Most of us want to have clear boundaries, but we actually don't want to follow through on the consequence part. We don't want to take the action that we say that we're going to take. But honestly, that's the most important part of the boundary, the consequence part, because otherwise your boundary is not going to be taken seriously. There's not going to be any validity to the boundary because even though you've stated that it's there, if you're not following through on the consequence, you're not establishing it. Failure to follow through on the consequence and act accordingly sends the message that the boundary actually doesn't exist. So it does you no good if you put a boundary in place and then the action of the other person persists, which like I said, many times it's going to. And you're like, oh shoot, okay, come on in. I didn't really mean it. Come on, let's get in here. Or if you're like, well, okay, here, just this one last time, here's some money. But next time, I'm not going to give it to you. When you do that, you lose all credibility. And why? Why is this so hard for us? Why is it so hard for us to enforce the consequence part of our boundary? A lot of us don't want to set and enforce proper boundaries because we don't want to risk losing our relationships. We're afraid that if we take care of ourselves first, and if we tell the truth about how we feel, that the other person might feel hurt or they might be upset with us. So there's a couple things I want to say about this. I want to remind you that just how other people cannot create emotions within you, the same is true in reverse. You can't create emotions within other people. You're not ultimately responsible for other people's feelings. You're only responsible for your own. And in fact, you think that you're protecting the relationship by not setting a boundary because you don't want to upset the other person. But really what you're doing is the opposite. When we aren't willing to set clear and appropriate boundaries, we start staying in and participating in relationships that are based on lies, that are based on pretenses, and that are based on resentment. And really, not setting boundaries prevents us from having true intimacy in our relationships. The ironic thing is, if you think about it, is that a lot of us are really worried on how our boundaries are going to be perceived by other people. So we're worried that by us setting boundaries, people are going to perceive us as rude or as uncaring or as high-strung. But then you have to think about how you actually act when people violate your boundaries that they don't know exist. And you just have this grin on your face and you just bear it, but underneath the surface, you're seething. So it's pretty ironic because when you don't put boundaries in place and people are violating your unspoken boundaries, you actually just end up acting in the way that you're trying to avoid acting by setting a boundary. Guys, listen, boundaries are really, really hard work, but they are the work of true intimacy. This is the work of really honoring yourself and what is authentic and true for you, and being willing to let other people interpret it and make it mean what they will. We can explain to someone like, hey, listen, this has nothing to do with you. I love you. This is just a boundary issue for me. And these kinds of conversations are really difficult for a lot of us to have. So what we do instead is we stay in the relationships where we're pretending, and then we wonder why our relationships aren't deep in quality, why they're not intimate relationships, because we're all just smiling at each other, pretending that everything is great, and we're not really telling each other the truth, and we're not having those honest conversations that really matter. So if you want to do a lot of deep work into boundaries, I actually highly recommend the book Boundaries. It's literally just called Boundaries by Henry Cloud. And in the book, he says this, which I think is so beautiful. He says, we have to honor ourselves enough to tell the people in our lives the truth and to set proper boundaries, not just for the sake of ourselves and our own honor, but also for the sake of the person that is doing the boundary violating. Because when you can set a proper boundary, when you can tell someone the truth about yourself and about where your boundary is, that then opens up the space for honesty and truth within the relationship. So that leads me to the next really important part about boundaries, is that a boundary should be set from a place of love. Love for yourself, love for the other person, and love for the relationship that you two have together. I do not advise you setting boundaries from a place of anger or from frustration. You're going to want to work through those emotions and get to a place of calm and peace and love before you're actually in a state of setting a boundary. Work through those emotions. And when you feel like you're genuinely setting the boundary from a place of love, here is how it can be communicated. You can say something along the lines of, like, look, this is a boundary issue for me, and I'm really not comfortable with this going on. And if it does continue, this is what I'm going to do. And I love you so much, and I value our relationship so much. And that's exactly why I have to be clear and straightforward with you about this, because I value you and our relationship so much. I want you to view the boundaries that you're setting in your life as, this is how I take care of myself. This is for me. This is not against you. And when you view it that way, you can really set the boundary from such a loving place. And you don't have to do it in a way where you're ridiculing anyone. So let's be clear on if you're setting boundaries from a clean place or from an unclean place. So you know that you're kind of setting boundaries in the wrong way, from an unclean place, if you don't feel peaceful. If you don't feel peaceful, it's not time to set the boundary. If you don't feel loving towards the other person, if you are trying to manipulate their behavior for your own benefit, so you don't have to follow through on any type of consequence, if you are blaming, and if you're negative, and if you're frustrated, or if you're just trying to delete someone from your life altogether, that is not a boundary. That is an escape route. I understand that a lot of us want to go to immediately, like, I'm just done with this person. Like, I'm done with them. They're out, right? Kind of more like the cancel culture mindset that so many of us have adopted. And I understand the desire to delete people from your life, to not talk to them because they trigger you in a way that's difficult. But if it's someone that you love and you truly value the relationship, then I want to remind you that it's okay to have people in your life that you love, but the relationship is still challenging, because the people in your life that trigger you the most can be your greatest teachers. And sometimes the reason that you want to delete that person out of your life, or that you don't want to have to deal with them, even if it's someone that you truly love, is because you haven't learned how to set proper boundaries with them, or you just flat out don't have them at all. And so this person is able to violate your boundaries in such a way where you haven't been able to enforce any type of line in the sand or consequence to protect your emotional well-being. Like I said, these people can be your greatest learning experiences, your greatest teachers. These are the people and the relationships that will give you the opportunity to learn how to be in a relationship with people and practice setting and enforcing boundaries. You can always be focused on what is there to learn from this relationship? How can I use this as an opportunity to take care of myself and to have love for this person, but to create more truth, more honesty, and more authenticity in our relationship? So like I said, the right way to set boundaries is coming from a place of peace and love. And you taking ownership over the fact, again, being an emotional adult and saying, listen, this has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with me. It's kind of like that breakup line, but it's really true. It's like, listen, it's not you, it's me. And that's the truth. This is simply just a boundary issue that I have. It's something that I need to put in place to protect my own emotional well-being. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's just going to make our relationship that much stronger and that much more authentic. Boundaries are such beautiful tools that we need to use in our life to create intimacy, not to block it. A boundary doesn't keep people out of our lives. A boundary just keeps people from violating important spaces in our lives. And when we have boundaries, the intimacy is always increased, not decreased. The truth is told more often, not less often. So if you are able to practice this skill of setting boundaries, I promise you, you will see your relationships become so much more authentic and intimate. If you're willing to have enough courage to honor yourself and to tell the truth, and ultimately to protect yourself and to protect your emotional well-being, you will see an increase of peace and intimacy in your life in all of your relationships. Remember, you always get to look out for you first and foremost. It's having unconditional love for people. It's being an emotional adult and taking ownership of where your emotions are coming from. It's knowing that you have manuals for people and working to drop the manuals that you can. And for the manuals that you can't, putting clear, safe, and respectful boundaries in place to protect your emotional well-being. That is really how we start to create the truest and most rewarding versions of our relationships. So, like I said, if you feel like boundaries is something that you could do some work in and need some help with, read the book, Boundaries, Henry Cloud. It's a fantastic book. Okay, next week, we have one more episode coming out on Tuesday of next week about relationships. We are going to be covering kind of the last key component, in my opinion, which is communication. So talking about money, fighting about money, disagreeing about money, having conversations around it. So that's going to be coming out on Tuesday. And then the following week, we are going to move on from the money and relationships silo, I guess you could speak, and continue our discussion on money in different areas. All right, I love you guys so much. I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed this bonus episode all about boundaries. I think it's a beautiful tool that can be applied in your life and within your relationships. You can always reach out to me if you have any questions at all, and I will see you next week on Tuesday. Have an amazing weekend. I love you. Bye. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Money Love Podcast. If you're loving the podcast, then I want to invite you to join me in the Overcoming Overspending membership. It's where we take this work deeper and apply the concepts and coaching from each week's episode into your own life. By being a member, you have exclusive access to my Overcoming Overspending process, 10 monthly live coaching calls with me, a private podcast, members-only community, monthly money topic and challenge, bonus courses, and so much more. There's nowhere else like it out there to level up your finances and life. Simply go to overcomingoverspending.com to join, and you can enter in the code MLP30 at checkout to save $30 on your first month inside the membership. See you inside.